Thank you so much for making the time to do this. Let's just dive into the deep end here, if you don't mind. I know we're going to talk about racial justice, and I've just been jonesing to really kind of bend your ear about that.
Sure.
Let me kind of set the stage specifically, and let's just dive into what I think is a significant barrier to racial justice, which is white privilege. And so just to kind of set the stage a little bit, and feel free to jump in and clarify or color commentary here, but white people have benefited from hundreds of years of racism and racist systems in the U.S. specifically that have systematically empowered whites and disempowered minorities. From the 1830 Indian Removal Act that forcibly relocated Native Americans to the benefit of whites, to the 1862 Homestead Act that gave away millions of acres of land for free to whites, to the benefit of whites, from Jim Crow laws that benefited whites to immigration laws that benefited whites. Social Security initially was, earmarked, well, we're not going to give that to domestic workers, so literally benefited whites. Post-World War II subsidies for returning soldiers that mostly, almost predominantly, completely benefited whites. Over and over and over again, white people have benefited from generations of accrued wealth, access, and privilege that we as white people, I still have a hard time convincing some of my white friends that this even, that we're not even starting at the same, forgive the terrible analogy, but if this were a race, we're not starting at the same starting blocks. In fact, the Pew Research Center came out with a study recently that said this, that white households are worth, this is right now, not like 50 years ago, white households are worth roughly 20 times as much as black households. That whereas only 15% of whites have zero or negative wealth, more than a third of blacks do. Effectively, the black family in America is working without a safety net completely. So when anything happens, a financial calamity strikes, an emergency, a divorce, job loss, there's no safety net. The fall is precipitous. So we're not just talking about sentiment here. We're talking about data that says white people in America are starting in a completely different place. They have a completely accrued system of privileges and access and wealth that minorities just do not have. Why am I having a hard time convincing my white friends that this actually exists?
Well, I would actually venture to guess that it's harder to convince white evangelical Christian friends of this kind of reality. And some of that has been written about from a sociological angle. Michael Emerson, my provost at North Park, Michael Emerson and Christian Smith have written extensively on this topic in Divided by Faith, saying that how one views the racial issue and conversation in America is very different, whether you're black or you're white. And whites, evangelicals, tend to view this from a hyper-individualistic angle and lens, to say, well, I personally have never owned a slave. I personally have never taken land away from a Native American. So there's no sense of, there's a system that's at work, there's a structure that's at work. Whereas African-American Christians, they understand much more what it's like to live within a system that's kind of stacked against them. So when words like white privilege, when words like structural sin come up, what Emerson and Smith point out is that white evangelicals don't have the right theological, sociological, intellectual tools to handle that kind of conversation. And so these words have no meaning to them because it's not within the theological, sociological vocabulary of white evangelicals. So I would say that's one of the major problems. In systems thinking, it's called, what are the mental models that we operate out of? The mental models of your typical white evangelical in the United States is so hyper-individualistic, that person is unable to see beyond that individualism. Whereas the African-American who lives in that reality, was born into that reality of structural, institutional racism and structural institutional bias, they're going to have a much better handle on what it means to deal with these structural issues. So the way I've struggled with it, and as an Asian American, I have kind of a different angle on this, a different approach to this. Several years ago, I was asked to speak to a group of Harvard Asian American students. And I was talking exactly on this issue, the structural problem of racism in America, that this is a racial injustice problem, not just a racial bias problem or prejudice problem, that there's some systemic structural issues at play here. And as I'm talking about this, I can kind of see in their eyes that they're not catching what I'm saying. They're kind of rejecting this, because let's be blunt. As a white person, you can say, well, I don't personally own a slave. I don't personally have not personally taken land away. But as an Asian, I'm like way beyond that. I'm even more innocent than you are, because our folks showed up here in the 70s, right? So the bulk of Asian immigration occurs in the 1970s. We got here way after all of that went down, right? So slavery, we weren't even around when that happened. Genocide of natives, we weren't even around when that happens. So I can understand how these Asian American Harvard students could respond to me to say, we have nothing to do with this structural sin. We have nothing to do with this structural racism. But then I asked them a question. I asked them, so the land that Harvard University is built on, whose land was it? The money that powered Harvard University to become this magnificent institution with billions and billions of dollars of endowment that allows you to go to school with these excellent students and faculty, where did that money come from?
It built on the backs of slaves.
It was built on the back of slaves. It was land taken from Native Americans. It was built on an economy, and I explained to them, you were benefiting from an economy that originates from free land and free labor, right? So if you are taking and kidnapping labor from Africa and using that as free labor to further your economic engine, and you're taking land away to further your economic engine, then what you've done is you've created a no-fail system. So if you were starting a business and I came to you and I said, I'm going to give you the warehouse for free, I'm going to give you the storefront for free, I'm going to give you all the goods and capital for free, and then I'm going to have friends of mine or relatives of mine work for you for free, you would have to be the worst business person in the world to not succeed at that business, because everything has been handed to you, privilege. You've been given free land, free labor, free capital. And out of that has developed a very healthy, robust economic system. And so did I personally own a slave? Did I personally take land away from Native American as an individual? No, I did not. But I benefited from a system that created wealth in a way that actually decimated a community, that actually destroyed and crushed different communities. So as a beneficiary of that system, I need to be held responsible for it. And like I said, as an Asian American, our mass immigration occurred in the 1970s. But I still say to these students, Asian American students, we're still responsible because we are beneficiaries of that system. Which is one of the reasons why I actually would love to do away with the phrase white guilt. Because the word guilt, the way we use it in our vocabulary, and even in our Christian vocabulary, really implies an individual feeling bad about something that we did. So let's say there's a person who 20 years ago thought a negative thought about an African American. You feel guilty. And so you got to deal with that guilt, that white guilt of having had negative thought about an African American 20 years ago. And the way you deal with it is by doing something positive now. You're going to take the King holiday off. You're going to go shopping instead of going to work. Or you're going to do something that honors Dr. King's legacy. Now what you've done is you've taken an individual action and felt an individual guilt for it and remedied it with an individual action that actually doesn't have anything to do with the original action, but that's the way you resolve guilt. So I prefer the phrase white shame, or actually corporate shame. And shame is much more of a corporate experience. It is, even though I may not have done something personally, I'm part of a system that abused the African American lives in our communities. I'm part of a system that devastated the Native American communities. And because of that, I don't feel the guilt, or I don't have to deal with the guilt of it, but I've got to deal with the shame of it. And that to me is a much deeper spiritual issue than feeling guilty. If someone feels guilty, they'll figure out a way to get rid of that guilt. Do something good at a very individual level to get rid of that individual guilt. When someone feels shame about this history, about this oppression, about this marginalization, disenfranchisement, the whole history that most of us should be aware of, that's a different response. We don't simply do something good to make up for that history. We have to deal with a shame that emerges out of that. And that's why I think the the Christians really should be leading on this, because we have vocabulary to deal with shame, whereas the world does not. In American secular liberal society, you don't deal with shame, you deal with guilt. But the church actually has the vocabulary. And this is where my work in lament, looking at the Psalms and looking at how deep that lament goes, it doesn't just do this quick resolution of individual guilt. It really cries out to God as a community to say, Lord, we have sinned. Lord, we have destroyed the good that you've given to us. Lord, we have suffered because of our sinfulness. And that's not guilt, that's shame. And I think the church, therefore, can lead on that rather than society, which only understands this in terms of individual guilt.